No, it's all good. We're waiting for computers. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today, the second day of InSite 2 and Sustainability Across Disciplines. It's an ongoing series in a collaboration between the Faculty of Fine Arts and the Faculty of Arts and Science here at Concordia. And today's event, at the moment, is titled Active Matter and Environmental Relations. We have Alice Jarry here with us, Natalija Miodragovic, so sorry Natalia, joining us on Zoom, and Charlett Wenig also joining us on Zoom today. But just to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourspace, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Fourspace, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, creating daily activities, examine research questions. We are running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting. And so those of you joining us on Zoom, we welcome comments or questions in the chat. We can read those out later on during the Q&A. Those of you here in the space, you might know this part already. If you have any questions, raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone over to you. Okay, it's now my pleasure to pass things over to Natalija Miodragovic. Natalija, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for this invitation. I hope so that you can hear me good. I will speak about the project Structural Textile that is going on in the frame of the Matters of Activity cluster, interdisciplinary research cluster. And about matters of activity, just briefly, it's not easy in 10 minutes to say a lot, but it is between design, humanities, and science. These are just some representative logos. And then you can see how our projects are structures between practices, structures, and codes. And these are actually projects in frames which operated, but then it's always in a larger sense. Practices like weaving are very much also involved with fiber techniques, anthropology, filtering more like in a sense of algorithm and coding, but also on a nano level. And cutting is also together with charité and robotic surgery and brain research. So where I am from a project object space agency, and then you see that we are here represented like structures, and I like to believe that the project Structured Textile is also kind of tackling the discipline, architecture as a discipline itself, like on the level of structural level. So I started this project a long time ago, and you can still see in Berlin its exhibition, which is showcasing cluster research between microbiology, material science, and design and architecture. And projects from Art and Design School Weissensee in Berlin were showcased, which are dealing with plant cellulose, paper, but also the research in bacterial cellulose. So it's kind of changing the notion of what cellulose is traditionally conceived as a plant-based. And for this large structure, 5 by 5 meter, is developed, which also started to be research in material system. And here you can see animation. It's from Living Beings project from Nelly Singer. That it's very good showing this environmental relation with active matter. It's actuated knitting. And in her project, she can really kind of design. So this is Nelly's project, but I wanted to show because of this title. And also Nelly was a part of the team, is a part of the team of the project Structural Textile. We developed the system based on rattan plant. And you can see already first images for Max Planck Institute and that we had opportunity to kind of see our own material in the micro scale, which is really interesting knowledge. So what we developed together with Nelly Singer and Daniel Suarez is a system which is based on warp knitting technique, which is usually industrial knitting, based on my previous research. And then with this, we can also, thanks to Professor Michaela Eder for Max Planck Institute, we gained knowledge about branching wood or reaction wood, which has more dense fibers. So with the preforming filaments, we could have a more dense, or as we said, more higher resolution of knitting or looser. And in warp knitting, you can interlock the loops in vertically. And thanks to this stable filament, it's possible to knit with hands, but also it's possible to achieve very complex geometries. And you can see that this biomimetic is going not only in a sense that start trying to simulate some biological structure, but also trying to be bacteria. We were knitting, it's 5 by 5 meter, we were wanted to be bacteria, and also looking how microbiological research reflects on architecture as a practice. And in this next step, it was decision to work with a local material, which is willow, which is in Europe largely used for biomass, for energy, because it's fast growing, but also the bark of the willow is used more and more in cosmetics. It's salix. Salicyl is base for aspirin, but it's used very much in cosmetics. So with this project, apart by developing one material system, which is basically architecture research, it's interesting that you can really, through engaging through disciplines, you can awareness about material itself. So it's based on local materials, and then you understand some other aspect, how it is used. And also I try to say that this looping system is trying to tackle also looping in economy. So this next exhibition, the idea was to kind of have embodied knowledge and a more larger structure, which is possible with more stable willow, which is 2.5 meters or 3 years to 2 years old. And then you see that we were preforming willow to form larger environment. And then for architects usually don't use the digital skills for this kind of immersion, which is a very interesting aspect of this. And then in this scale, this what we saw on the project of Nelly Singer, this interactivity with humidity, it's more kind of plasticity of material that it can be formed. And then also with the application of different properties of the structure or density, we can have more stable and more elastic material. So structural textile is interesting because textiles are not so much, are always perceived as something which is into tensile structure. And here it's kind of possible to have structural columns. I wanted just briefly to show through this engagement with material, I realized that you can listen surfaces with the willow branch, and then artists also did their own VR project, antenna project, and you can see that it resulted in hacking this VR with the willow branches. This just briefly to show you how it looks. This was just a normal office room, and how this research influenced also the environment where we are working. And I have also theory that the presence of this material influenced also other researchers. And where the project is going now is to larger architectural environment. And if you can see in the upper row, from finite willow in the textile industry, we were able to develop continuous willow, and we call it wooden yarn. And this yarn is now can be processed in the larger coarse machine to make a really larger architectural element. And this is where I am going now into producing larger architectural element. And because it's biomaterial, it is possible to grow fungi, local fungi on them. So this is for architects interesting that this can be scaffold, it can have complex geometry for concrete, for adobe, but also it's capable for growth. And then I try to compress everything in 10 minutes. That research is going in the larger. I took the structure of filamentous mycelium that we are using to show how the research is going on on the larger filamentous structure, then in the middle development of the yarn like hyphae in the hyphae in the mycelium, or you can see down on the right side is a cell wall of hyphae, which is open for weak interaction. And this is, for me, this kind of association to the layered membrane. And this layered membrane is very interesting for architecture because it's open up possibility to see architectural skin like something which is capable for harvesting and filtrating water or pollution rather than kind of be protective and separate environment. So this is what I wanted to show, that through this engagement, we, in this, I call it holistic approach, where we can really tackle communities, but also landscapes, and have a better awareness of relation of environment and society. And this is a little bit insight of research with mycelium, that for me, this is kind of a model of this nature culture, that it's not separated, that it's all together. So what we see here is a Hanf, larger on the right side, larger Hanf, which we are using for mycelium and mycelium to see fibers and filaments in different scales. And on the left side is a braided yarn in a mycelium. So this research starts to be biology driven by testing, then the growth starts to be criteria. So the structure that we developed, and this is also thanks to Charlett, these images, you can see what is inside. You can see the willow and the hemp wool, and this kind of, I call it deep coating with mycelium. From filamentous fungi, Fomes fomentarius, which is also local or not as a tinder mushroom. So I hope so that I am in time. And this is a little bit to show that we started this interdisciplinarity, that it's between microbiology, applied biology, and where is now research going is between fungi, also sheep wool, and larger structures. Thank you very much. I hope so I did it on time.
Okay, hi, can you hear me? Can somebody give me a sign if you can hear me well?
Charlotte,
Yes?
we can hear you very well.
Okay,
Thank you, Natalija.
great.
That was great. Over to you.
Thank you, thanks a lot. So let me start my presentation. Share. Right. Sharing the first screen. So you see my presentation? Yeah? Okay, great. So, hi.
Sorry, we're seeing your notes at the moment. If you could do the switch screens.
Yes, great. I'm gonna do that. So switching this. Now let me see. Before it was fine, no? So now this and that.
Oh,
Do you see my notes?
I can see your slide behind. So if you could drag that window, the notes window, if you could drag that to the other screen. There you go. That looks good. Oh,
No, wait. Why it was, I mean, it was so well before and now it's not working, but
you shouldn't have tested it.
it's a typical show effect. And of course, now I also closed my PowerPoint. But I can already, maybe while I'm opening it, I can already say a few words to me, not too losing too much time. So hi, thanks for the invitation. I'm Charlett Wenig. I'm industrial designer and material researcher working at the Max Planck Institute of Colloids and Interfaces. And let's see, do you see it now?
I see that now. That looks fantastic.
Okay, great. So perfect. So I'm working at the Max Planck Colloid and Interfaces. I'm also part of the Matters of Activity cluster. So thank you to Natalija for already introducing that part of us. And yeah, so my start is I have to say as an introduction, actually, I'm a really bad designer. So, or as to say it in the words of Victor Papanek, there are professions more harmful than industrial design, but only a few. And of course, it's unfair to claim a whole profession that there are the reason that the man-made mass is already exceeding the biomass in the world. But of course, with being a designer, you transfer ideas, concepts, and objects into the real world. And I think we are responsible for the choice of our materials and manufacturing processes. So therefore, in my profession, I'm looking into which kind of materials are used, which kind of materials are already in the production. I'm mostly focusing on local biomaterials like waste from slaughterhouses, like animal bones, bark from the wood processing industry, or my recent project is about working with paludicultures, so plants of re-wetted areas. Due to the time, I decided I'm focusing not so much on my current project. I will focus on my PhD project, which is the bark project, and to show you one part what was actually done in that research. But before, as I said, I'm part of the Max Planck Institute. The Max Planck is a German research organization, over 80 institutes, mostly in Germany, but also a few on other places. And in the Institute of Colloids and Interfaces, we have 4 different departments, as you can see here, which are mostly focusing on physics and chemistry and biology. And it's mostly about fundamental research. So what is a designer actually doing at a fundamental science research institute? So I'm trying to combine design methodologies with analyzing the structure of organisms like tree bark to actually thinking about high value applications which have a high cascade utilization. High cascade utilization means that actually you are looking after you harvested the material for something where you have a low modification and where you have a long sustainable use. And then with every life cycle, you actually start to downgrade your material. So it comes from the solid wood to the particle boards, fiber production, chemical extraction. And then after a long, long time, you decide to use it for energy input. But if we're looking into the wood processing industry, we see that actually it's a different story. So the really nice stems, which are like really straight, they are going into the veneer and furniture production. Everything around, also these kind of too small ones, too bendy material, they're all getting into chips and particles. And then we have a massive amount of side products where also tree bark is part of that. So 10 to 20% of every tree is bark. And therefore, the question is like, how can we use this material to use it as a high valuable material, like reverse life cycle and cascade utilization, and not that it goes directly into energy input as it is now. So the most bark gets burned wet in the sawmill straight away. So, but what is the reason why bark is actually so underrated compared to wood? So one reason you can already think about it, if you walk through a park, a pine looks different than a birch as an oak or a beech. So there's a lot of structural differences within the species, so between the different species, but also within the species. So for example, in pine tree, you have on the top this really thin called mirrored bark, and on the bottom you have this really thick bark, also called borke, for example. But bark was not all the time this kind of complicated material which we just use for side purposes. If we look into the history, we can see that actually this material was for a long time used for high valuable products, and then with industrialization, it started to go down. Though this research was mostly focusing on how to analyze the structure and the properties of the local bark species in Berlin-Brandenburg and finding new concepts for applications with tree bark by combining science and design. So we were looking into the material structure and composition of the investigated barks, evaluated methods from crafts. So we looked also into the history of bark and in the nowadays industry. We thought about how to use it, but also analyzing how these different treatments are actually changing, for example, the structure and the material characteristics of the bark, and thinking about possible application fields for tree bark. So now bark mostly gets shredded in sawmills industries to small particles, and it would be really nice actually to use this amazing material in these kind of meter-long scales as it actually comes. So therefore, we decided to go to in the forest and peel by our own. The method of bark peeling could be claimed as a forgotten technique, because we really had to talk to people who are experimental archaeologists to figure out what is the right time for harvesting bark, what are the right materials for the tools, and how to do it. If you harvest bark, it's mostly in late spring, you get this kind of material which is a little bit like, I would say like a kind of a little bit stiff carpet, but you can move it, it's flexible. But with time, bark starts to get really dry and really brittle. But this kind of like textile haptic is actually super interesting. So therefore, we used an old leaf conservation technique. So we used a water glycerol solution. Glycerol is the same what you use also, for example, in the food industry. And the glycerol particles get into the bark and then extracting moisture from the air. And with this, it was possible to flexibilize the bark. Then we started to do tensile tests, to see how actually the characteristics of the material are changing due to this process. And we could see that if we have a dry material, that then dried bark is really, really stiff and you cannot really stretch it. If you have wet bark, you can stretch it a lot, but you really tear it apart easily. And with the glycerol treatment, we could on the one hand get this kind of, let's call it middle stiffness. So it took a little bit more more power to tear it apart, and we could even increase the strain. So this was actually really nice. So with this kind of textile-like material, we start to think about what could be the functions. So bark is there to protect a tree. So we were thinking about, can we actually take bark as a protective function for humans? And the first concept we did, where we decided to create a jacket out of bark to see like how it feels to be protected and surrounded by tree bark. So this is the jacket made of local pine bark. This is the other side. And the feeling was a little bit also like leather. So therefore we came also up like, maybe we can use it as a substitute for leather jackets. But also there we did tensile tests. And so bark is 5 times stiffer. Here you can see this strain amount which is possible with bark compared to leather. So on the other way around, lack of flexibility was the reason that our model was not possible to lift his arms, which is of course really unfortunate for fashion purposes. But if you think about materials which are used in textile industry, like for example cotton, also cotton has not a crazy amount of flexibility or strain inside. What makes these kind of materials so flexible is the way how we process them. So we do not change the chemical composition, but we change the geometrical structure. And this is the same what we did with the bark. We went to a manual weaving chair and we're thinking about like which kind of weaving methods could actually help us to increase the flexibility we need. We use in the end a twill weave. It's the same what you also use for denims. And with this, it was possible to lift the arms in the next jacket. On the right side, you also see like different concepts of shoes we tried out. We claim them as the original Birkenstocks. And this was like the first idea about like how to use bark for protective functions. But the thing was that the material things are really small, and actually we even peeled bark in 11-meter lengths. So therefore it was actually interesting to think in architectural scales. And if you look into the history, until the beginning of the late 20s, there were also huts made out of tree bark. So we decided to do an installation where we use bark in an architectural scale, but we didn't went for a hut, we went for an abstract object so that people can start to fabulate and speculate what could be done out of bark. And with this, we created the bark sphere. So on the left side, you see the bark surrounded by their siblings. It's exactly the place where we also peeled the tree. And with this, it was also possible for different people to feel like how it would be to be inside bark. So with this, I come to the conclusion that bark is a versatile material with various shapes and processing possibilities, but it requires an understanding of its natural properties. The material limits are not weaknesses, but material boundaries to be considered in design, making the interdisciplinary cooperation essential to unlock its full potential. And through a symbiosis of science, humanities, and design, existing practices and knowledge from all fields can be combined, fostering also new research questions. So this could lead to a revolution in the use of increasingly precious raw materials, which are currently treated as leftovers, side cuttings, and industrial waste. And with this, I would thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Charlett. I think we'll go to Alice.
Yeah, you can see my screen. So, well, thank you, Natalija. Thank you, Charlett. It's a real privilege to discuss with you this morning. And perhaps, well, I can introduce myself. My name is Alice Jarry. I'm a prof in Design and Computation Arts. I'm also the director of the Milieux Speculative Life Cluster Biolab, and Concordia Research Chair in Critical Practices in Materials and Materiality. And the reason why we gathered today, maybe if I can provide a bit of context before starting, is because I was a visiting scholar at the Matters of Activity Cluster of Excellence in Berlin during the fall semester, and I'm going back in the spring, and I had the incredible chance to meet with Charlett and meet with Natalija and discover their work. And it's actually a very, I would say, dynamic interdisciplinary group of researchers and scholars. And I feel really privileged to have the chance to go more in depth in your work today. It's really great. Thanks, Charlett. Thanks, Natalija. And thanks, Piqué, and everyone at Ford Space, and Anna also for the organization, and Rebecca. Thanks for the invitation. So I took a little bit of a different approach for this presentation. I'm not going in depth in one project. I'm just going to survey different projects that look at questions of residual matter and how it is transversal to different research creation projects and material prototypes I'm doing at the moment. Okay. So I'm interested in site-specific works, art science practices, and socio-environmental design, and I focus on how to transform active and biomaterials for the built environment and the arts. And so central to my research is this idea of a residue that's defined as something that's excluded or lost from the history of a material, energetic, social, or technological system, and how we can reactivate these materials through objects, installations, events, and so on. So there's not one single material, but there's this transversal concept of residual matter. So the Research Chair in Critical Practices in Materials and Materiality is a platform that supports 15 emerging researchers. It includes research creation in biodesign around residual, bio-inspired, biocomposite materials that intersect with practices in materials engineering and environmental science to develop new response for more resilient engagement with our environment. So the Biolab is a hybrid research creation space for the development and facilitation of conceptual and material-based exploration around the technosphere and the changing status of life on the planet. So a few questions we address: how to navigate methods and concern to materialize sensory and sensitive experience of critical issues that are often invisible, distributed, delocalized, how to apprehend the complex entanglements between the biosphere and the technosphere, and how can we rethink the relationship between the material and computational realms in terms of interdependence, adaptation, and cooperation. Okay. So these questions, they unfold across different projects, and they're all entry point to investigate aesthetic, social, sustainable, political, and public dimensions of materiality. A new emergent and exciting project that's just starting is co-led with Building and Civil Engineering at Concordia and the chair in Sustainable Building Materials at ETS, which is about recycling dredged sediments from the St. Lawrence River and seeing what kind of new materials and artistic intervention this can yield. Another project, for example, that we are conducting at the lab is Excitable Matters of Process, that mingles biodesign and mechanical engineering to explore the behavioral potential of biomagnetoactive materials that are usually made from very unsustainable rubbers and polymers, and how they may be sustainably designed to sense, to actuate, and to interact with their environment. With the Biointerface Lab at McGill, we also explore the reactive capabilities of graphene oxide, which is a nanomaterial that's derived from the oxidation of graphite. And it can also be synthesized from organic waste, and it's totally compostable because it's just carbon and oxygen. And it can also self-assemble in 2D and 3D structures. So we kind of designed this material so it reacts to heat, to humidity, it can move, it can shape shift, it can also foster plant growth. So we're developing surfaces and scaffolds using that material. Another project just completed concerns air pollution and looks at its material, spatial, and temporal aspect and its impact on the body. So we design flexible filtering membranes, and we use plant-based biomaterial and low-tech data capture device, and to investigate air particle and how we can make the invisible more tangible. So the research looks at the concept of filtration, and it's interesting because Natalija and Charlett also mentioned this idea of filtering and porosity between environments. Understood as an interface, so an interface to materialize the microscopic invisibility of air and the macroscopic dimension of their issues. So we placed nomad objects in the urban space. We recorded levels of particles, carbon dioxide, and other pollutants. And different apparatus also capture images of urban environment. So all this air quality data informs the behavior of wind and light that circulate through an immersive infrastructure that's composed of abaca, which is a natural fiber species that's, I would say, a cousin from the banana, water, bioplastics, and plants, such as strawberries and mosses, that are known for their bioindicating properties. So this whole system filters air, actually. And so for addressing these questions of air quality, we did a lot of field work for a few years, examining the surroundings of the Metropolitan Expressway in Montreal. And with a flow of like 100,000 vehicles per day, the highway crosses different multicultural neighborhoods. And that question also the ideas of energy, but also social inequality. In particular, if you look at this highway in its eastern part, it has historically witnessed several waves of extractive practices and social friction. In particular, if you look at the neighborhood of Saint-Michel in Montreal, it has been home to quarries that have been transformed into landfills, cutting into the existing social fabric and amplifying like smell, traffic, waste, and so on. Okay. So to look at air quality, we worked with environmental scientists in Montreal and Paris and look at how air is black boxed, how it's sensed, how it's modeled, and how it's transformed into data as well, and then to be mediated to the public. So this led to a kind of reconsideration of sensing as a form of embedded experience and knowledge production, and how objects and experiment can circulate between arts and science and different practices. So we developed those kind of embodied DIY methods to sense air pollution. So here we have a solar-powered kit that is not really a good tool to capture data, but it's really a good proxy to engage with urban environment and to attune to sites, visuals, computational fragments, and to understand the city better. And all this work in the air monitoring stations made us realize that beyond data, tons of porous surfaces exist and appear as sensory interface capable of producing different affective forms of representation. So the action of detecting and filtering just extended to different materials that were inspired by these stations. So we developed semi-living and living filters using flax, abaca fibers. And the goal was to encode air pollution within the materials themselves. And so the materials can become signature and material evidence of air in a way. So the goal was also to make information, environmental information, more legible, experiential, and embodied. So this led to several co-design workshops with public stakeholders, scientists, to rematerialize air through biomaterial kits, urban walks, microscopy, plant seeding, among others. So this participatory context, was really helpful in understanding how publics engage with materials and ecological issues from an everyday practice, and how research questions and methods can be transformed along the way. So in its final form, recapture modules, they enable different biomaterials and plants to become witness of their environment. For example, they enable the boundary layers of moss and the leaves of strawberries to capture residue. So this is interesting to link micro-scale event with macro-scale event, like larger social and technological system, and to reconsider the impact of human activity by transforming the response of organic and living organism into different active witness of contaminants. So this method kind of translated into my ongoing research project, which is still in progress, and it kind of bridges with Charlett and Natalija. And I will conclude in a few slides about the research I'm carrying at the moment, which mobilized my time in Berlin at the Matters of Activity cluster in the fall. It's in progress. I can't really predict what is going to be the material outcome yet. But following this work on air and this kind of site-specific methods, looking at materiality, residues, membranes, infrastructures, I really became interested in Tempelhoffeld, situated in Neukölln. And it's an area that covers 3.5 square kilometers in Berlin. It's the site of the former Tempelhof airport. It's the largest inner city open space in the world, and it's Berlin's largest city park. So basically, this space is fascinating because it's at the intersection of past and future, and it's interfacing history, geopolitics, materials, gentrification, community gathering spaces, gardens, refugee housing, urban planning issues, and so on. So between the air and the ground, how do you engage with the scale and amplitude of that space? I became interested in the layering and temporality of Tempelhof residuality in a way. So how can its remnant act as material witnesses to create new relationships between different social and material assemblages? Can art and design intervention uncover residual narratives for this space? Here you see a glimpse of an area within the field with community gardens. Okay. So one way of apprehending the scale of the site was through different forms of zooming in. So I conducted a lot of field work and historical and archival research, also did field microscopy. So this place is so big, I thought that the only way to apprehend it was to zoom in, basically. So it's also a journey I'm apprehending with a great deal of humility and questions and slowness and ethical questions, given that, well, on one end, the social political complexity of that site, both past and present, the communities attached to it, and on the other hand, also the fact that I don't live in Berlin. So how do I approach this site from an outsider perspective while respecting the site? Okay. so through this process, I really questioned my role as a researcher and what could be a non-extractive way to engage with the site and the materials. So would it be through harvesting strategy? Would I take away from the site? So rather, I became interested in questions of traces and surfaces. So here you can see clay imprints of Tempelhof infrastructure and Tempelhof plant species. So I'm currently working in a biolab to transform them into biocomposite objects and surfaces, as well as working toward visual physical mapping of the site. So I thought it was a good idea just to loop back to Berlin to open up the conversation. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Is Natalija there?
Yes, you're looking for.
Ah, there you are. Yes. Oh, wow. Thank you so much. I really appreciate Natalija and Charlett being here. Also, Alice, my colleague, who I'm always in awe of. And I'm really, really impressed with the sensitivity, the engagement, the in-depth respect for the sciences and the arts in how you produce both the idea of materiality, transforming waste, and the beauty of the results, whether you have it in application, but the possibilities of what your presentations have given us, I think, is really astounding. So thank you. Now, I just want to ask if from these three presentations, would you like to add anything that relates maybe Alice to Natalija or Charlett to Natalija in terms of any discoveries or things that you find overlapping in your work from these presentations?
I have ideas, but I will let Charlett and Natalija start.
I can add that I think I missed to say somehow that there is a definition of low diameter, small diameter wood that I'm using, that it's a non-timber wood or it's a forest rest or forest residue. And also this is the same how fungi are categorized or other products from the forest, but also the wool in Europe is thrown away. It basically doesn't have any value. So people just throw it away. So I just want to add, because also because of Alice was also showing this from Rax Media Collective, that I appreciate very much Art Collective, because they are very much what I was trying to show, that it is architectural research, but it's also kind of trying to tackle this role of connection between science and society that Isabel Stengers was kind of asking for, that it may be possible.
Charlett?
I would say like one like really dominant overlapping between Natalija's and mine research is these looking into fiber-based and textile structures. And I think this is something which really came up the last years, to realize that if you want to work with biomaterials, you have to start to think in new ways, because I had the feeling that for a long time, where plastic was like the dominant material, that everything was like thought about like how to produce plastic and can we also do it in the same form with other materials. And I have the feeling that now over the years, a lot of designers started to rethink actually and being like, okay, what is actually closer to the material and which kind of processing methods are actually closer to how biomaterials behave. And biomaterials are growing, and therefore these kind of like structures, textiles, which are also growing with every knitting, with every fiber you put over each other. I'm really happy to see that a lot of concepts are actually now like actually finding overlappings and similarities with this. So this was this I think is something which is like growing a lot, and which is like I'm happy to see that in so many materials and possibilities, this is actually giving really a good output. And yeah, this is first comment from my side.
Well, yeah, thanks, Charlotte and Natalija. And maybe something I could add that maybe echoes what Charlotte is saying. There's also the positioning of the designer. Like, how do you embrace uncertainty and also embrace time? Because when you start designing new biomaterials, you start from scratch. So you need to start with the properties of the material. And of course, there's all sort of like manipulations you can do, but it's much more a form of alliance with the material and setting up initial conditions that you improve over time, I would say in cooperation with the material, than trying to impose a final outcome. Sometimes what you imagine in the beginning is not possible, and conversely, something you never imagined can come up in terms of material property and form. So I think there's this question of, okay, embracing temporality and long temporality, because it's something to work with plastic and to say, go to the shop and cut a piece of plastic, and it's something to grow a sheet of material. So it's a completely different relation to time, and maybe also to failure. I think you become very resilient to failure as a human when you work with biomaterials. So it's yeah.
Before I continue with, are there questions from the audience?
If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Those of you online, if you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat, and we'll read that out loud for you.
Anyone? Okay, so I will continue. Oh, yes.
Here, I'll get a mic to you just so that those online can also hear what's going on.
Thanks for the presentations. I'm Jill Ditter. I'm faculty in English at Concordia and co-director of the Speculative Life Cluster at Milieux, where Alice also works. Yeah, I was really interested in the way in which the objects and data and materials that you're all working with circulate between the arts or the fine arts and science. I was wondering if you'd say something about your experience of working perhaps with scientists or perhaps just the science, and where you see the science integrating some of the insights and I guess practices that you're exploring in your research. I'm wondering if you feel like the exchange is equally two ways, and if not, where you see the friction and how to overcome that.
Who wants to start?
Let's start.
Charlotte.
Oh, go ahead, Natalija. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say Charlotte because she is really in a science institute. Charlotte, you want to say? I can just say that it is really giving giving in a personal insight in the material that you were working with, but also understanding how scientists work. So it is, I thought in the beginning, oh, their discipline is so disciplined because we can do much more, but then it makes you also aware of all the failures of architecture, and that also maybe design and architecture seem more free. It's also hard to make changes in practice. In research is more easy. So yeah, I think Charlotte can say more, but it is this micro scale, this dive into a micro scale. This is what I'm trying to kind of with this woven structure to make this temporality and this scale kind of experiential, but also it is another speed. It's another, yeah, like another temporality in the sense of rhythm. Charlotte will be more precise.
I can try. I mean, with standing since 10 years in different laboratories, I have to say for me, it's sometimes hard to still draw the line and being like, this is science and this is design and this comes from that. But for example, what I remember when I started was that I was surprised how similar it actually is, how often hypotheses are quite the same, methods we are using quite the same, trying out is quite the same. But I have also to say that I see it like Natalija, that definitely the time and the speed is very different. And this can be sometimes a clash in outlining a research concept and an experiment in science is really often much slower than what we do in design. So also like these kind of like, let's just try it out is something which is sometimes really hard when it comes to things in a scientific scale. And also, of course, when we're talking about scales, that is a thing. But what actually is really nicely to see is that really often micro scale and macro scale actually are like a closed loop. So if you understand the micro scale of a material, you can really go into deep concepts in design on the macro scale. So therefore, these like thinking about how are materials behaving in a hierarchical structure, and then thinking about scaling it up is something I think where it's a real potential and where also both disciplines are kind of an eye level. So this is what I realized due to my research time, that actually you can really if you are open to the other profession, and if you are also like continuously sharing what you do, that then you can really have these kinds of like vice versa. So then it's not just like designing something nice for I don't know, for the science, but then it's really like there are, for example, for me, when I do experiments or when so I did these flexibilized jackets, and then we were like, oh, why is it so flexible? What is actually happening? And then we started to looking into the microfibril angles. So why is actually this material why it has the possibility to be flexible, and why, for example, other tree bark is not possible to be so flexible. So with a design question or with a design purpose came a scientific question back. And this is something really nice to see, that you could research on a million different angles, but if you, for example, using design as a conductor, then you can say like, okay, let's go into this research angle. And I think this is actually something where design and science can work really well together.
Well, yeah, thank you, Natalija and Charlett, and thank you, Jill, for this question. I think it's a really good question, and there's no like single answer. I think that Charlett mentioned that it is very similar. I would say it is very similar, maybe in the field of like say material design and material science. I feel much closer to like I mean intellectually and practically to say a material scientist than a dance performer or a painter, for instance. But we are in the same fine arts discipline, but it's just much more remote. But there is also something I would say that's clearly needed when you work in an art, science, engineering kind of setting, is that kind of time that's needed to understand each other's discipline and to avoid to instrumentalize each other. So how do we work productively with each other, respecting everyone's expertise and what we can bring? This takes time, and I think that Charlett mentioned it, and Natalija also is really the question of time and how you get to know each other practices, each other's lab environment, each other questions, and how design can contribute to science or engineering and vice versa. And I think there is a broader, I would say, systemic institutional question that we also need to ask is because it echoes what you were asking, Jill, about the can science benefit from the results of fine arts? And like, can our methods be transferred or inspired science practices? I think so, but it also demands a very specific setting where the results of fine arts, because we have in a way more currency, like we can do exhibitions, we can do workshops, we can do site-specific work, we can do objects, it's not just a paper. but those results must be valued in other fields. Like, you know, I worked with a team at McGill, for instance, and they're like, okay, we're doing an exhibition in the end with objects, it's really great, but it goes in the volunteering section of my CV. So like, how can we value those things? And at one point, it's not a lab problem and it's not a practice problem, because concretely in the lab, we both learn, but after that, it's how do you value that? Because it's easy for us to value everything, but the other way around is not so easy. So, yeah.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point about the value of deliverables. What does science value, peer-reviewed papers and so on, where artists can have exhibitions and that be just as valid. But what I find really remarkable is it seems to me that all three of you are very invested in this collaboration to the point where you may not be schooled or have a PhD in science, but you've really invested time and respect for each other's disciplines. And I think I'm really, the visuals are extraordinary. I must say that I think you've represented your complex work, the weave, if I can talk about the weave between science and arts, macro and micro. For me, the way you all three have articulated and visualized is really impressive. I think that both people who don't have a science background and those who maybe don't know so much about the arts, I think these three presentations have really articulated how we can represent both. So thank you. And I see, do we have time for any questions?
Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. Thank you so much for this conversation, but I think I'll hand it over to Rebecca, who wanted to ask our one last question. Yes?
Okay.
I did, if we have time. I'm so sorry. Charlotte, particularly for you, but maybe for the rest of you, just your work on the bark jackets was so interesting. But I wondered if you have considered Indigenous expertise here. The Haida, for example, the Pacific West Coast Indigenous peoples here in North America have been using cedar bark for generations and generations to make clothing, for example. Is there a role also for science, the arts, and the Indigenous expertise to work together or to learn from the expertise of our traditional peoples?
Thanks for the question. Just quickly before I answer the question, I want to say thanks, Alice, for making the point beforehand that it's about how to value interdisciplinarity. This could be a whole penny in its own, because you said like there are different like currencies, and this is something which is like really a hot topic about how to value these different things and how to think about outcomes in the future. But this maybe we can one time tackle in another setting. Thanks a lot for the question. So in the research, what we did was mostly also looking into history of how bark was used. We used mostly like focusing on the bark we were using. So for example, I used birch bark. So I was looking into Scandinavian, or also like, for example, also in the like areas like tundra where they actually were using the material for clothing. But the point why we used jackets was we wanted to try out the protection. And actually it was not so much about a jacket, it was about protection, and it was not about fashion. So if I would have more time, I would more elaborate on that this was something, for example, where in the end I said that the choose of object was actually a fail, because I wanted to provoke discussions about how to use bark and which kind of functions we could use. And with designing something which was like really specific, it started that people were discussing about fashion, about the jacket, about could we wash the material, or do you have these jackets also in my size? And that was the reason why we then decided in the group to shift to these abstract objects, because I was like, no, it's not about a jacket, it's about the function. And therefore, we did a lot of research into what is done with bark in different areas. But for example, I would not do fashion with bark anymore. I think with cedar and bark, you can do amazing stuff. It's beautiful. It's material specific. properties used in a perfect way, but for example, with Brandenburg pine bark, I would not do that anymore.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you, Charlotte, Natalija, Alice, PK. It's great to have you in here for this conversation, but also thank you for the questions, joining us online, and those of you here in the space. Okay, I'm just gonna let you know, we're gonna close up the Zoom. We're gonna keep the Zoom running, but we're gonna close up the live stream now. We're going to take a pause, though, before the next part of the series that starts at noon, I believe. Yes, zines is a form of material resistance. So please stick around for that. And just a reminder that this conversation remains available on our YouTube channel. You should revisit it there. And also, you should have a great day. Thank you. Bye, Charlotte. Bye, Natalija.